Welcome into another episode of the Key of David podcast. I've got my two co-hosts, Trevor Keys and David Douglas, and we have an amazing guest for you that's going to give you another view and another take as it relates to Joseph Smith and the martyrdom. And we're going to get into some Joseph Smith prophecies. We're going to get into all sorts of stuff. But we have on our show today Brian Stutzman, who's joining us from Idaho Falls. And he's written several books about Joseph Smith. The one that I was the most interested in when I looked it up was Joseph Smith Prophecies, and we're going to dive into that. Brian, welcome to the Key of David podcast.
Good to be here.
Okay, well, we're going to jump right into it. And Trevor, I don't know exactly where you want to go with this. If we want to jump right into the martyrdom of Joseph Smith and discuss that, or do you want to go prophecies first?
Let's have him hit on the book and talk about that a little bit. And then let's just so that everybody can get a plug of the book, everybody can go search it out. But then let's jump into the martyrdom, and let's particularly look at the political assassination, because I think that's what a lot of people are buzzing about right now.
Awesome. So here's a little bit about me and how I even began writing about this. I live in Idaho Falls. I'm a businessman. I have some real estate, and I wanted to take my kids, each one of them when they're teenagers, on their church history trip, kind of coming of age trip. And so my number three son, we were living in Carthage, and we left town, and we were a little bit early for our flight, and saw this little green sign that said Warsaw on the right before the bridge that goes from Hamilton to Keokuk. And I didn't know that area very well. I've obviously spent so much time there in the last 10 years. And we went to Warsaw, and it was this cute little dumpy river town that had seen better days. And I wanted to buy a book. And so I Googled history of Warsaw, Illinois, and there was not one. So I spent about 6, 7 years writing one and going back and doing research and lectures at the Historical Society. Filled up the high school 3 times. It was really, the people back there were really curious why I, from Idaho, was writing their history. And I came across so much information about the tensions, the lead up, the martyrdom, the claims of the local people that they did it afterwards, the trial, and what happened to the tenant from that time forward. And so I feel like that I've actually been told by a lot of people, including people there at Warsaw, that I know more about Warsaw than any person alive. That's kind of not real. That won't buy me a dime. I've lost so much money. I did write a little book. I think I get like $2 from Amazon every time somebody buys one. I will never pay for all the travel, and that's okay. I didn't do it for money. I do real estate investing for money. So I'm just thankful that I wrote that. So that's kind of how we got there. Um, that's why the book, and that led into something we'll talk later. You're muted, Trevor.
Have you written a book before that? Was this your first book?
I wrote a telecommunications industry book that was privately published years ago, but that was the first one. That led it more into like the books on the prophecy of Joseph Smith. And my brother-in-law kind of put some of it together, and I went to. And
So when you were writing it, did you actually think that you were starting to write a book and it just took 7 years, or were you just writing along the way and all of a sudden, epiphany, I'm going to write a book?
no, I started out. People told me just write an article. I said no. There's so much to tell here,
Cool.
because Warsaw's about so much more than just the people who murdered Joseph Smith that lived there.
Well,
What's it
tell
about?
me, yeah, tell me about Warsaw, because I'm one of those people that's pretty clueless as it relates to Warsaw.
So it's 18 miles south of Nauvoo. It's right on the river, and people settled that area before the Saints came in the 18. Well, the first white settlers came there at the end of the War of 1812. That was 1814, and then they built a permanent fort there, and then they kind of grew. There was the Moine Rapids, and it was by Keokuk. In the most of the year, you could not get a riverboat past Warsaw headed north until they built the Keokuk Dam. That made Warsaw extremely important economically. Nauvoo was on the north side of that. It was commerce at the time. It actually had some other names too. There's a little post office there. But the trade back and forth, people would have to unload their boats and go and put their cargo on wagons and then go, and it was called lightering. I don't want to get too technical. I have a whole chapter of the river in my about the river in my book, but it tied Nauvoo when the Saints eventually came, in 1839. The city got their charter in 1840. It tied those two communities together because you had to do commerce in both. And then 18 miles the other direction is Carthage. So it makes up a triangle. Some people have called it the tragic triangle with Warsaw, Carthage, and Nauvoo.
And is Warsaw the town that supposedly had like a curse on it, or they even felt like they were cursed? When I went there, my grandma served a mission in Nauvoo, and we stopped by some town, and I heard this story, and I can't remember if it was Warsaw or not. Am I making that up?
You're not making it up, but I'd rather talk about the history of Warsaw. So Warsaw, kind of grew in prominence when the Mormons, when the church landed in Quincy, and after the extermination order, which happened in October of 1838. The Saints, barefoot, they had millions of dollars stolen of property and of clothing and of homes and farms, and they came almost penniless to Quincy, and the good people of Quincy gave them refuge. And then the next spring, Joseph Smith is allowed to escape from Liberty and comes across, and then they go up. They're looking for land. Now, it's really interesting. A couple things happen here. If you don't mind taking a deep dive. If you think about the church, and they started in New York and went to Kirtland and then went out to Missouri, why did we end up going back into the belly of the beast, right back into Illinois, right back into the United States if we were being persecuted, instead of completing the journey west? Every move the church made was west. Why did we take a giant move east? Well, it's because of land. See, there were land speculators like Isaac Gallon. Isaac Gallon had bought land on both sides of the Mississippi. There's Montrose on one side, Nauvoo, what became Nauvoo, on the other side, right? Well, he wrote Joseph Smith in Liberty Jail and says, I'll make you a really sweet offer on this land, zero down. You just pay me over time. And guess what? Joseph knew that the church had little money, so it was appealing. So we came to commerce, made it Nauvoo. The people in Warsaw wanted the church to stop and buy land in Warsaw. If you're going to buy land, buy it here. We'll sell it to you. The country was just coming out of a major depression in 1837, where half the financial institutions in the United States had failed. People had land they were in debt for. That comes back to what you'd asked me about a curse. There's been maybe some prophecies, I would say. The people in Warsaw wanted the church to buy land, and people who Joseph Smith said no to ended up declaring bankruptcy and were financially hurt in the 1840s because the church didn't buy their land. They had extended credit. They bought land in Warsaw, was hoping to turn it. They did. The church said no. Some of those people were involved in the trial in 1845, people who were declared bankruptcy because the church wouldn't buy their land.
Wow. Yes. So there were people speculating because the church was growing. So people were like, I'm going to buy this. I'm going to, leverage myself up. And then when the church didn't, they were mad. They were upset.
That is absolutely right. And I write a little bit about my book, and that happened in Warsaw. But Warsaw grew, and there was two major political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats. As members of the church came up to Nauvoo, you could vote in 6 months if you came from Europe. You could get legal status in Nauvoo if you came here legally, and you could vote in 6 months. And so as Nauvoo went from 1,000 people to 5,000 people to 10,000 people, Warsaw, 500 or 600 people, 800 people, looked up and said, we're getting outvoted because Mormons voted as a block, which was very common for religious communities at the time, to block vote. And so what happened is people in Warsaw, people in Carthage, people in the county that were not Elias have formed band together. It's 1841, 1842. They formed a political party. They left the Whigs and the Democrats. They formed the Anti-Mormon political party.
Jeez. Wow. Can you imagine that today?
If you had that, exactly. If you had the anti-whatever, anti-Baptist, anti-Lutheran political party, anti-Mormon.
The Southern Poverty Law Center would be all over those guys as a radical white
So you're saying
This is all running.
anti-Mormons have been organizing for a long time.
They were nice here, and originally it was just to get political power, but it quickly turned into plans to get rid of the Mormons from the area, and they even talked about murdering Joseph.
And then, I mean, to be fair with them, they knew what was coming, because how long did it take Nauvoo to be the second most populous city in all of Illinois? I mean, what was that?
Some
5
people,
years?
some people said it surpassed Chicago, but it was definitely a major player.
That's
And
crazy. So, yeah, I mean, think about it from a U.S. standpoint, with the immigrants coming in and 6 million of them coming in, and how brilliant that plan was for the prophet. Imagine if we could get baptisms up by doing that today. I'd love it.
To be fair, people came because they were gathering in Zion, not to vote.
I
That
know,
just happened to be something that they could
but they
do
were
while they got.
terrified. Hey, and how come the LDS, while we're on the subject, what's your opinion of how the LDS voter bloc has fractured? Because I would say at any point, it's probably like 50, 40%. Like it used to be pretty conservative, and I feel like the Southern Baptists have done a really good job keeping that conservative vibe. But more and more and more LDS are breaking off and are liberal. But we still love you, liberals. But it's just interesting to me culturally what's happened.
Yeah, I've got my opinions. It's probably not the right place, but I grew up in the era of Ezra Taft Benson, and Enemy had done that, and I just came from a family reunion, and part of the people said, they remember the old days. How can you be a Democrat and vote, or how can you be a Mormon and vote for Democrat? And today, I guess one of the people there is really good friends with somebody who writes for the Salt Lake Tribune. I guess Gordon Monson. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He wrote
Oh
about
yeah, definitely.
how can you be Mormon and vote for Trump? So
Right,
it's both sides.
right.
How can you be Mormon and
Holy
vote for Democrat?
smokes.
How can you be Mormon and vote for Trump? You're right. There is different louder voices and maybe more of a political fracture that now. But
That's
back
an
in
astute
Nauvoo,
observation. So it could have a lot to do with the last 7, 8 years of Trump being Republican and people being morally convicted to. Interesting.
Okay, so
That's a great perspective.
I've got
let,
opinions of that, but okay, go on.
Okay.
let's jump back to, we're kind of at that time where the people are starting to realize that politically the Mormons are, almost a danger, and they view it as such. So I want to get into what is kind of happening and what some of those rumors may have been about, people conspiring to kill Joseph Smith because of the political pull that's happening in Nauvoo.
There's three things happening. There's definitely political, and I talked about in my book. William Smith actually beat Thomas Sharp. Let's see, yeah, Thomas Sharp for state in the legislature. A lot of people don't know that happened, but then guess what happens? 1844. Joseph and the brethren get together and they can't find a candidate that they like for president. So they form a new political party called the Reform Party, and they run Joseph Smith as presidential candidate with Sidney Rigdon from Pennsylvania as a vice president so they can meet the rules. They had a convention. There was 20, 26, 28, 28 states, 26 states. They had delegates from every state come to the convention of the new Reform Party. And some people felt Joseph Smith could win. You got to remember 8 years ago, they sat there and said, oh, Donald Trump has zero chance at the very beginning, and he won. People said,
So do you think him running for president was a Joseph Smith and crew idea, or do you think God? Because I'm not aware of any revelations that exist that God says, Joseph, I want you to run for president. So do you think this was Joseph saying, hey, I think I can make some change and I'm a powerful leader? Or do you think God was saying, I want you to do this, Joseph? Do we know?
I think there's not a recorded revelation, but I think Joseph was very much prompted in most everything he did of a major way. Okay. And this was definitely major. They had established a council of 50 to help bring about the political kingdom of God. And this was just another way they had political missionaries going out, as well as proselyting missions throughout the United States. So political power was definitely one thing. In fact, again, Hiram was going to run for the Senate.
Really?
Yes. And Joseph was running for president. And his platform was revolutionary. They were going to take government money. See, the government was making money off sales of land as the country moved westward. They were going to buy slaves and set them free.
Wow.
And Illinois was a free state, but Missouri was didn't like that, and there was a lot of political conflict already with the state of Missouri. In fact, one of Joseph Smith's greatest prophecies happened. I know that's maybe something for a little later on.
No, throw it in right now.
Did you just say?
go.
Well, wait. Before you go and transition there, did you just say? I want our listeners to hear that the Joseph Smith political platform, part of it was he was going to take proceeds from the land that the government was making, government money, and he was going to buy slaves freedom.
Yeah.
Whoa.
This is in 1840. 1844.
Wow.
It's completely revolutionary.
I wish we had this podcast on Juneteenth. That would have been perfect.
Or June 27th, because we'll get to the martyrdom. but still, I'm so glad my anniversary's on June 19th, and I'm glad that they made it a national holiday a few years ago, so I never forget my anniversary. We're 33 years into this. Or in Puerto Rico, you guys know Governor Boggs, William Lilburn Boggs, had issued the extermination order in, as I said, October of 1838. Well, I think it's in 1842, somebody took a shot at Governor Boggs when he was at his house. You guys know this, right?
Yes, no. I've heard the story. Is this the Porter Rockwell?
Yeah. So Porter Rockwell, for some crazy reason, happened to be in Independence that day, and Porter's only defense was, well, it wasn't me, because whoever shot him missed, and I would not have missed.
That's a good statement. That's a good statement.
So he left, and he was down in St. Louis, and they found him, and they basically handcuffed him, or in Porter Rockwell, and brought him back to stand trial. Okay, now it was a shoo-in. It was like Chad Daybell up in Idaho. He was guilty, and everybody knew it, and he was going to get convicted. Well, Warren Porter Rockwell, it was such a negative, hostile environment. Everybody says, well, that's the last we'll see of him. He was there, he had means, and he had motive, and he was there, and we have no other suspect. Joseph Smith, a few days later, after he was arrested, said he prophesied in the name of the Lord that Warren Porter Rockwell will be set free. And in December that year, they couldn't convict him, and they set him free against all odds, and he came back to Navajo. Warren Porter Rockwell.
That's
they
awesome.
Arrested him. Again, he had motive, means, and he was there.
Yeah.
And they thought he would be hung. Okay, but Joseph prophesied. So Joseph had over 400 prophecies outside of the Doctrine and Covenants. We think of things like maybe the Word of Wisdom or the Civil War prophecy that's in the Doctrine and Covenants, or all the things that are written in the Book of Mormon. Those are prophecies of those people. The Doctrine and Covenants is prophecies of God and the Lord speaking through Joseph Smith for that. But he had 400 statements, forward-looking statements, drut prophecies, such as
tell us 5 or 10 of them. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, just fire away the prophecies. Let's get into these. Listen, you've got 3 of the biggest fans of Joseph Smith on this podcast. I mean, I've got right here, I just bought this. This is a painting of Joseph Smith. I just thought it was such, I'd never seen a painting like this. It stood out to me. Yeah.
I want that for my museum.
Yeah. So we're just
about, can we get to that? We were talking about Warsaw. Economics. We did talk about that. It's closed communities traded within themselves. A newspaper editor in Warsaw in 1840 said, you can look in our town and not find a single thing from Nauvoo to buy or sell in Warsaw. And then he snidely remarked, and we're probably better off because of that. So we have politics, economics, and then, of course, religion. The church in 1843, Joseph and Hiram introduced at the High Council plural marriage. Now, they denounced spiritual wifery of John C. Bennett, the first mayor of Nauvoo, who was excommunicated, and other people who were trying to practice polygamy of some sort. But Joseph and Hiram introduced this doctrine to the High Council in 1843. Word got out. People were offended by it. William Law, in fact, on the powder keg of the mob that came to Warsaw, from Warsaw to Carthage to murder Joseph, they wrote on it, killed June 27th, they spelled it with a K-I-L-T, June 27th, 1844, Joseph Smith, the polygamist. That's what the mob who killed Joseph Smith wrote on their powder, and that powder, it's in the Church History Museum in Salt Lake today.
Wow. That's kind of like the Marines painting on the bombs that they're going to
Right.
drop in Iraq. It's the exact same thing, right?
Everybody, it was common knowledge that plural marriage was being
so I got a
think-
question about that. So the meeting that you say in 1843, Hiram and Joseph introduced this doctrine. Was that in the Council of the 50 and in the notes that recently just came out? No,
the Council of
where
50
is
was
that?
a different organization. People went home and there was a podcast. Kimberly Watson Smith, Brian Hales, and Jacob Hansen all have referenced that. People went home that night and wrote it in their journals. And William Clayton was one, but there was somebody else that was a little more easier to find. See, Clayton's journals were just released, but this has been around for a while. People came home and wrote about it. And the next year, in June 7th of 1844, some of these dissidents that were in the meeting wrote about it in their newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor. And they had not only sections of 132 that had been given, they put affidavits in as well in the Expositor.
So I have a question about the Expositor as well. And this came from one of the comments of people on one of your videos that was a good question. So what percentage of 132 of the full text was put in the Nauvoo Expositor? Did they have it written out? Did they have the whole entire thing?
I don't think they had a copy. I have a reprint of the Expositor, and I just recently read it.
Do we know if it's like half of it or like 10% of it? Or
I think it's a very small percentage, but it talked about the topic, and there's some wording in it. I haven't done a comparison.
Okay,
but there is parts of 132, the whole theme of 132. But the Expositor was much more than that. The Expositor called for the repeal of the Nauvoo Charter, which would mean no militia. Of course, the militia, Governor Ford, that's a different story. Governor Ford.
Who are they asking to repeal the charter from? That was one of my questions. Is that from the governor, or who can repeal their charter? Because isn't that like
the state legislator?
The state
legislature granted it, and they eventually did repeal the charter.
They did.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Nauvoo was without a charter for a while.
I didn't know that.
That's a different story. They divided into wards, and it became the city of Joseph for a short time. There's a whole history there. So the charter was repealed. Eventually, they called in the Expositor for mobs to attack the city. But the big thing is, and this is what we got to remember, the laws testify in their newspaper. They believed Joseph Smith had been a prophet, but he had fallen. They believed the Book of Mormon was the word of God. They established their own church. I mentioned that, the Reformed Mormon Church, with the laws of the Higbees and others. And the whole reason they wrote the Expositor is they felt called to publicly call Joseph Smith to repentance for this abominable doctrine.
So this is something that was a big aha moment on one of the videos I saw you talk about this, and I did not know that the owners of the Nauvoo Expositor were members, some of them high up. And I think Joseph Smith even said that they had their washings, and he says they were endowed, and they were completely upset and flew off the rocker when the polygamy doctrine came out, and this is what they were going to expose. I had no idea they were members.
Well, William Law was in the first presidency.
I didn't know William Law was part of the Expositor. I never made that
William
connection.
and Wilson Law, his two brothers, as well as Chauncey and the Fosters, and Chauncey Higbee and the Fosters, and others I'm glad you mentioned he did say that these people had their endowments. See,
Yeah.
there's somebody out there that's saying that the temple was invented by Brigham Young. Yet Joseph Smith talks, he introduced the endowment in the red brick store in what, 1842,
Right.
43?
He said they had their washings. He didn't say washing and anointings, but their washings.
Yeah, but as well as their endowment.
Yep, as well as an endowment.
And we weren't talking about the Nauvoo or the Kirtland endowment, which is in Dr. Governors. We're talking about the endowment ceremony.
Right.
So Joseph introduced polygamy or marriage. He introduced the endowment. And he was the first U.S. presidential candidate assassinated.
Was there any concern, and I know we looked at this earlier, because of polygamy, was it against the law? Like was it
Well,
explicitly, like, how could he run for president if it was, you know what I'm saying?
The term polygamy, it's plural marriage, and they were doing religious sealings. Here's the problem. The problem is that we don't have a lot of contemporary records. In fact, we have almost zero. We have some later, sometimes faulty, sometimes good recollection, especially during that came out during the Temple Lot trial. And that's a whole different subject where members of the church were called upon to testify in the Temple Lot Church versus the reorganized church over the ownership of some property there in Independence on the Temple Lot. What is it, 79 acres or whatever it is? We own part. That's where the Temple Lot Church is. And so there's so much speculation and so much.
There is a ton of speculation because a lot of people, I mean, the other position is like he didn't have children. If he was married to all these people, he has no children to show for it.
Absolutely.
And so it becomes quizzical, like, okay, what was actually being practiced here? Was it what we think it was? Because if it was to raise up a nation, he didn't do a very good job at that.
That came later. Full polygamy as we know it was in Utah Brigham Young. The practice, and this is after my research, the practice was sealing, dynastic sealings of different families to the prophet. They would bring people in and say, we want our family to be sealed in the attorneys. There was no owner's manual with Doctrine and Covenants 32 and how this all worked. And so they were kind of just, they'd seen, okay, a lot of these people came from Europe and knew that this prince of this country married this princess of this country to form dynastic empires. Well, spiritually, they were taking different people and bringing them in and sealing them.
And I read this. I mentioned this to Shane. I said it was kind of like it got out of hand in Nauvoo, and it was like a multi-level marketing scheme where people being like, "I'm signed up underneath Joseph. Bring your family and seal yourselves unto us, and you'll be in our downline."
That's one way to look at it, or one speculation.
Well, there was a John C. Bennett. John C. Bennett was going out there and competing, trying to get people to, be sealed to him instead of
sign
Joseph.
up under his downline.
Yeah, John C. Bennett was before this. But
was it? Okay.
Oh yeah, John C. Bennett left, I think, in 41, 42 early, and this wasn't rebuilt in 43, and that's why Joseph and Hiram were yelling against what John C. Bennett was doing. It was unauthorized polygamy, like Jacob 2 talks about, unauthorized. But God has always authorized polygamy at certain times. And the biggest one is the house of Israel, the tribes, 12 tribes came through polygamy. Jesus Christ came through polygamy. And later on, out west, it was used to build up a people. And our leaders in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, both me and my wife, we come through polygamy, and we have a marvelous, wonderful heritage. And the leaders of the church, most of them came through polygamy at the time, and then God took it away. And somebody said, well, there were more men in Utah than women, but how many righteous members of the church? See, they had people building railroads and miners that were not part of the church. And so it's pure, I mean, there's the enemies of the church. People, let's just figure this out, okay? There's a lot of people throwing shade at Brigham Young and people after him, John Taylor, etc. It all stems back to the succession crisis. And this is way off from your question about Warsaw.
Yeah, no. I love actually going to the succession crisis because I want people to understand. Like, I'm a huge Oliver Cowdery fan. Like, I love Oliver Cowdery. It's a shame that he left in 1838. But I tell people all the time, he could have gone to a variety of different places. I believe that he had some kind of experience, and the Lord said, "Go join the body of the church." While Emma, who he was friends with, didn't join the body of the church, and his own father-in-law and family, the Whitmers, who started the Whitmerites, he chose to go with the body of the church, and that should teach us something. Because if anybody at that time, like, we're talking about a guy who had some Joseph Smith-esque type experiences with Joseph Smith, and he chose to go and join Brigham Young, John Taylor, and that group, and only by, I think, revelation would Oliver Cowdery choose to do that. And I think it was really important that he did that. And I just want members of the church to understand that, hey, everything in the church isn't happening perfectly, but stay with the body of the church. Don't go and start your own little group. It doesn't work out. Stay with the body of the church. If you don't like how things are going, we have a voice and we can suggest, hey, I don't like how things are going, but don't break off and then become an enemy to the church. That's not what we should be doing. But let's talk a little bit about succession.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we're 3 days away from the 4th of July. That was one of Oliver's biggest speeches, the 4th of July, and then, of course, his SALT speech. I'm a big fan of Oliver myself. So we got to get back to Warsaw, and that affects the succession crisis. Okay, so as the church got stronger, they kind of pointed to Joseph specifically and felt like he was the author of, Thomas Sharp wrote, author of All Our Troubles, the Mormon leaders, and they called on people from Missouri to come and help them. And then what happened? We talked about the expositor. The expositor said all these things. The city council met for a couple days. They decided to have the marshal give an order, have the marshal destroy the expositor. The expositor was published June 7th, one issue. A couple days later, they threw I think it's the 10th of June, they threw the type into the street. They hide the type, it was called, threw this press in the street. See, freedom of the press didn't really apply to states and counties and cities until a 1931 ruling of the Supreme Court called Neer versus Minnesota. Also, libelous printing, libelous speech is never protected. And so they thought they were within their legal rights as a government body to throw this press in the street. It had their own press in Missouri destroyed. No legal charges were filed, and there was presses all up and down the Mississippi had been destroyed, no legal charges. That let off a powder keg, and Joseph Smith decided to, as mayor, declare martial law so they could put a curfew to quell.
So it's just craziness happening at this moment in time in Nauvoo.
It's not only quelling the locals, but any people coming to the city. They wanted a curfew. And that's the charges eventually that kept Joseph in jail. But when that happened and their expositor press was destroyed, Charles Foster came down to Warsaw, sued Thomas Sharp at the Warsaw Signal, and he came with a letter that Thomas Sharp printed and says all these things had happened. And Thomas Sharp wrote underneath, he says, basically, hey, everybody, look at what happened. We can't sit by and let the Mormon leaders get away with this. We don't have time to comment. We need to make our feelings known with powder and ball. And that was on the front page of the newspaper. Said we have to exterminate the Mormons. Now, the word exterminate, which has been exterminated from Missouri, that was kind of an inflammatory word. Okay. So
they were already organizing, and Joseph had a target on his back.
Him specifically, and when the newspaper article said, let's basically get a mob and kill him right in the front page of the paper, get your powder and ball out, let's go take care of this, we don't have time for comment. Joseph saw this and he thought, they're after me, I'm going to go across the river. and they
Right,
go around
right.
Montrose and home, and then they were called back through some letters back. And
Do you know
they
who?
said,
Do you know who actually called him back? I've heard a
Emma.
couple of different stories. I heard it was Emma too. Emma
I believe it
says,
was Emma.
Joseph. Yeah, that's the way I heard it. I believe it was
Emma.
Emma Smith that said, "Hey, come back. You'll get through this. You'll be just fine."
I'm pretty sure. We've got so much going on here. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact letter or a copy of it. I believe it was Emma, I'm pretty sure. But he comes back. They make a couple attempts to go to Carthage, keep coming back, go to the Fellows Farm, is Fellow. They finally make it to Carthage, and they go to the first charge was the destruction of the press, which was riot, and that's bailable. The post bond, there's 17 men, I think, charged with that. And they go to the Hamilton House, which is a hotel, and Joseph gives a remarkable prophecy I'll tell you about in just a second there. And then they're charged with treason, just Joseph and Hiram, nobody else, for declaring martial law. And the treason against and they cannot post bail against treason. And so they're moved to Carthage.
So they intentionally charge him with treason, knowing that if we charge him with treason, they can't post bail.
In fact, Frank Worrell told Dan Jones, he says, we got Joseph right, essentially, we got Joseph right where we want him. And if you knew what was good for you, you'd leave town because he's not going to live in it. That I'm paraphrasing.
So, and they're worried about him politically as well. I mean, at this time, he's running for president. And so he's also a political threat to the nation. Political
threat, a religious threat, economic threat. So Joseph and Hiram go with their party over to the Hamilton House. Now, all these little cities had, like Nauvoo had the Nauvoo House, Warsaw had the Warsaw House. It was a hotel restaurant. In Carthage, they had the Hamilton House. So they're over there, and Joseph, there's the laws and the Higbees are staying there, as well as people. There was people from all over the country there in Carthage. This was a national hotspot, and they all had intentions of killing Joseph Smith, and they weren't too shy about letting it known. Well, a group of men came to Joseph Smith at the Hamilton House and asked to see him, and he comes down and he essentially says, "I'm Joseph Smith. Now, what do you want?" They said, "We just want to meet you." And he says, "I'm not the type of guy. Do I look like the man that I have been portrayed?" And they said, "No." And he says, and this is an awesome prophecy. He says, this is, let's see, June 25th, 1844, at the Hamilton House. He says, "You cannot see my heart, but I can see yours. You thirst for my blood, or you thirst for blood, and my blood is the only blood that will satisfy you." Then he goes on to prophesy that they will see this scene to their full satisfaction, but the time will come where they will face the cannon's mouth from sources yet unknown or unexpected, I guess was the meaning there. Well, 2.5 years later, 2 regiments from Western Illinois, including some of the men, most of the men that were there at the Hamilton House, were called to a war in Mexico called the Battle of Santa Anna, or Battle of Buena Vista, and they were fighting Santa Anna, the Mexican general. And these men that were at the Hamilton House got suckered into a trap, and Santa Anna collapsed on them, and they retreated, and they were shot and killed by friendly fire.
Oh no!
Oh wow!
From a cannon's mouth, from a direction that they would not think of, and that the I didn't quite get the wording right, but that's the meaning. Direct fulfillment 2.5 years later of what Joseph prophesied in the name of the Lord. And it was recorded then. That's another prophecy. We're up to number 2 now, right at the Hamilton House. So let's get back to what we're talking about here. Joseph and Hiram go to the Carthage Jail to await a legal hearing on these charges of treason because they couldn't post bail, right? So they're up there, and the night of June 26th, Joseph gives we'll get to number 3 prophecy, a remarkable prophecy to Dan Jones. Is it okay if we continue this route here? Okay.
Who's Dan Jones? Yeah, absolutely.
So Dan Jones Dan Jones
And, and if you could speak a little louder, I just want to make sure everybody can hear you fine.
You bet. You bet. Dan Jones was
That's
a
better.
riverboat.
That's so much better.
Awesome. I pulled it closer. Dan Jones was a riverboat captain. He was originally from Wales. And he, like a lot of people who came to America, he did what he knew. He was a riverboat captain in the St. Louis area, and he would read the newspapers, and they would reprint articles from across the country. And he started reading articles about the Mormons in Nauvoo, written by the nemesis of Joseph Smith, who was Thomas Sharp of the Warsaw Signal. And he was berating the Mormons. And Dan Jones read these articles and said they can't possibly be true. The Mormon missionaries came, the church missionaries came. Dan heard the gospel. This was 42, 40, spring of 43. And he believed it and was baptized in a frozen Mississippi in St. Louis. And he joined the church and came up and met Joseph Smith and became fast friends. He received a mission call to return to his native Wales. So he goes with Joseph to Carthage, and they are there the night before the martyrdom. And Joseph Smith prophesies. They're laying there. They hear gunshots outside. They knew they weren't safe. It was about midnight. And Dan Jones talks to Joseph about dying. And Joseph turns to him and he says, "You're not going to die." He says, "You will yet see Wales and fulfill the prophecy, fulfill the mission appointed to you." That was one of his last prophecies. The next day, Joseph asked Dan to go to Quincy to go get his attorney. And so he gives him some legal papers. And as he comes down the stairs of the Carthage Jail to get on his horse, some people see him with papers and thinks that he's going to go get the Nauvoo Legion to spring Joseph Smith from Carthage. And they shoot at him multiple times and they miss him. They don't kill him that first time. They turn around Dan Jones' horse enough that he gets confused and he doesn't go down the road to Quincy. He actually goes down the road to Nauvoo. And we later learned that there was a military brigade, a mob on the road about a mile outside of town with orders to kill any Mormon. If he would have went the right way, he would have been killed 2 times. And he finally hits a riverboat on the Mississippi River to go to Quincy, and he comes down past Warsaw, and the people of Warsaw stop the boat and search it, and miraculously do not find him because they were going to kill him. And that was the 3rd time in the first 24 hours Dan Jones avoids death, and they were going to kill him, and he does make it to Quincy. Well, 3 times he avoids death the first 24 hours in fulfillment of Joseph Smith's prophecy, and Dan Jones went on to become one of the greatest missionaries of the Restoration in Wales. He not only went 1 time, he went 2 times. And through his preaching and conversion and teaching with the Spirit, thousands of Welsh people joined the church and came to Salt Lake. In fact, if you have a Preach My Gospel book, on lesson 1, page 1, is a painting of Dan Jones preaching in Wales.
Wow.
And if you go into Provo MTC, there is a mural of that same painting of Dan Jones preaching in Wales in fulfillment of Joseph Smith's last prophecy to a person.
That's awesome.
That's the spirit of the restoration right there that you just testified.
They were having a conference in Salt Lake. I think it was 1849. They needed a choir. Some of Dan Jones's converts that had come over to Salt Lake were Welsh and they knew how to sing. They organized Dan Jones's converts into a choir, and that became the foundation for the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, called the choir at Temple Square.
Incredible.
All because, first of all, of Thomas Sharp dissing on the church and creating converts because of negative articles, and Joseph Smith's prophecy, last prophecy to a person, coming true to Dan Jones. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so let's get back.
Number 3. So they're laying in the jail.
Yep.
The mob comes. Well, here's what happens that morning of June 27th. 2 regiments from Warsaw and then 1 from nearby Green Plains assemble in Warsaw. And they march up to a center point between the tragic triangle, Nauvoo, Carthage, and Warsaw. And it's called Golden's Point. You can go there today. I was there 2 months ago. and they have a meeting. Thomas Ford had left Carthage and he was in Nauvoo. He was scolding the saints, telling them to simmer down, and they had already taken the militia's arms. And he hears that this mob is in Golden's Point. They thought that maybe they had heard that Thomas Ford was being kidnapped by the Mormons and they were going to go out and rescue the governor. Thomas Ford heard that they were there and sent a message and told them to go home. Just then, Frank Worrell, the same guard at the Carthage Grace, who told Dan Jones that he'd better leave town because Joseph wasn't going to live another day, essentially, he sent a note to the mob and said, now's the time to do the deed. In other words, we got Joseph here. Come and take care of this problem, political problem of ours. Thomas Sharp gets up and he talks to the group. He says, some of you guys may go home, but we think we should go on to Carthage and finish off Joseph Smith, because if we kill him, the Mormons will get mad and kill Thomas Ford, and we don't like Thomas Ford, and we'll get rid of two problems at the same time. A third of the people went back to Warsaw, including Charles Hay, the group's doctor, some Chittenden brothers. We know who went back. We also know who went to Carthage. They painted their faces, some red, some yellows, with mud and gunpowder. They stormed Carthage Jail about 5:15, and they went up the stairs. And at first, Joseph thought it was the Nauvoo Legion rescuing him. And he opens the door to greet his friends, and he realizes who it is. And he curls back and hits the first guy in the face. And they tumble down the stairs off the landing there. And then they regroup and come back up. And they start firing pistols and muskets. Okay.
How did Joseph and them get, because they had weapons as well, right?
They had two guns.
How the crap, listen, I've been to prison. I spent 5 years in there, just so you know. You can't get anything in there, let alone a pistol. So how did they get a pistol and that smuggled in? Do you know the story of that?
Yeah, it's pretty easy. They hadn't been convicted. They were there for their own safekeeping, and they weren't in the. They were thought about putting in the jail, and then they put them in the bedroom. They had people.
Okay.
They weren't in jail. They weren't criminals.
So they weren't like in the jail. They were in a different part of. So when we say Carthage, it's important that we understand that they weren't in a jail cell. They were in like a lodging area.
Yeah, it was
jail.
Stiegel's. The jailer was named Stiegel, and interesting enough, most people don't know this. He had a housemaid, and it was William Clayton's daughter, who wrote "Come, Come, Ye Saints." But he gave up his bedroom upstairs for Joseph and Hiram and whoever chose to be there, John Taylor, Willard Richards.
So truthfully, he would have been safer if he was probably in the prison or in the jail himself rather than in this area that he was in.
In most jails, yes. In this jail, no. Because the door opened, there was many people have been there. You could shoot right in.
Well, listen, I've also been in prison, and when certain people come in, the guards may decide that because of somebody's charges, they're just not going to go ahead and they're going to put him in there with the wolves. So I understand that as well.
So the mob comes up the stairs and starts shooting. Joseph gets off 3 shots, 3 misfired, 3 shots, and they injure 3 people. We know who they are. Boris was one of them. Well, this is important because the next year there's a trial. In fact, there's a grand jury that indicts 9 people. 3 people don't show up because they still had wounds from being there. Only 5 showed up for the trial. 3 of them were injured. They were there. They stormed the jail. They shot in. There's a gunfight. Some people say, well, was it an inside job? How ironic that they waited till the mob was there shooting in. And we know they shot in. There was 40 or 50 bullet holes in the walls. Okay.
Now, a lot of people, and Trevor brought this up earlier in our pre-call, a lot of people say there's no way that they shot muskets in there. It would have done this, that, or the other. What would you say to that?
Ridiculous. The crime scene wasn't preserved. I mean, O.J. Simpson got off from a tainted crime scene that was 3 days. I mean, they started collecting evidence that day. And with some guy, Furman didn't put his glove on first before he tweezers to pick up the bullet.
And you also said that the bullet that they found in, was it John Taylor's hand?
John Taylor's hand was from a musket, not a pistol. It was too big.
And so in that sense, that there were musket type bullets that were found.
Both.
No, yeah. Musket and pistol. So it's a gunfight.
It's a gunfight. And it was so slow, they had to hand guns down the stairs and reload them outside or get the landing and hand them back up. And I mean, it was a it was over a long period of time, and smoke filled the room. It was pretty intense. But here's the thing. Joseph Smith did not die upstairs.
Right, because he jumped out of the window and said, I'm a dead man.
Well, he said, no.
Oh, Lord, my God.
That's right. He said, oh, Lord, my God, it's the beginning of the Masonic cry for help, because there's Masons out there and they didn't respond. Oh, Lord, my God, is there no help for a widow's son? And he jumped out and he was very much alive. And the mob took him up against the well that's there, lined him up. He was very much alive. He looked up at him, and in firing squad fashion, they shot him dead outside the wall, outside the jail up against the well. And they went to decapitate him, because there was a $500 reward. And we talked in the pre-show, that's worth about what, $22,000 today.
Yep.
But there's somebody yelled, the Mormons are coming. There's a count or two of a flash of light from heaven. And the firing squad froze. They loaded them in a wagon and drove them away. A cannon was shot. The mob fled, a lot of them back to Warsaw, and they told and bragged about what they had done, that they had killed Joseph Smith. They published it in the newspaper 2 days later, and on July 10th, a week and a half later, they published in the newspaper that they had done this, and that normally says, we're normally a law-abiding community, but we felt in this circumstance that we had to take the law into our own hands, and it was the right thing to do, and anybody familiar with the circumstances would agree. Front page of the Warsaw Signal, a confession.
So what does a guy like Justin Griffin say to that? Well, you got people that are saying, we did this. We're the ones that killed him. How does Justin Griffin
it's
handle
hard to argue that?
I don't know. I did a debate with them, and he didn't hear a word I said. So, and a guy named Taylor Smith did 2 videos with him showing how the logistics work. Okay, they say, well, Hiram looks like he took a bullet here. Well, I believe, and there's proof to this, that Hiram was hit in the back and fell backwards, and the shot came up through his chin and out. And it wasn't right there. And how do we know the gun wasn't right under his chin? Couldn't have been. Because it would have obliterated his chin with smoke and gunpowder and the ball and fire. See, these guns shot fire.
Yeah, there would have been burn mark.
There would have been burn mark. Well, the death mask, and I've got a first generation death mask right behind me. I can show you. It's right here on the floor of both of them. Well, the original death masks, and you may have seen the video where they kind of did some doctoring at the bottom here. So don't look at the death mask. Here's where the proof is. After the martyrdom, they brought the bodies back. How many people was it Friday or Saturday? This was June 28th or 29th. How many people came through the mansion house and looked at the bodies in the viewing before the funeral? 10,000 people. And not one of them said, oh, it looks like Hiram was shot. Look at this burn mark under his chin. Did somebody put a gun right up to him? How could they have done that? John Taylor, did you do that? Willard Richard, did you do that? No, there's no accounts of that. What we have instead is Joseph not dying in the jail. He died by the well. Firing squad. And the next few, you know what the legal charge was? It was the people versus, it wasn't Taylor or Richards. It was the people of Illinois versus Colonel Levi Williams, who lined up the firing squad and ordered the killing of Joseph Smith. And he stood trial along with William Grover and Jacob Davies. And we know the 5 people who stood trial. And they just sat there. They didn't testify. They didn't testify for or against, and never once. And if they were convicted, they would have been, by the way, the charge wasn't murder. It was conspiracy to commit murder. they would have been hung. And not once did they say, you know what, we happened to be there, that's true, but we saw John Taylor shoot Joseph, or we saw Willard Richards shoot Joseph, and you should bring him here to and hang them.
That's a really good point.
It's a really
Wow.
good. It's
That's
a really good.
really
It's a really
good
good
point.
point. They would have said, "Hey, we were
For
there. We saw
sure.
this."
Now it
I
even
can't
gets
believe that
better.
they
Yeah,
didn't
you
even
just
create a
obliterated
testimony.
it.
So they didn't even give a testimony?
No, they didn't didn't testify. The trial was really interesting, but here's the big thing. In 1846, what happened? They decide with all the anti-Mormons that the Mormons must leave. And so in February, we have the first wave of Mormons headed to Nauvoo. And we actually have a total of 3 waves of Mormons, but we weren't going fast enough. So these same people who stood trial, including Thomas Sharp, join in an army, and they bomb. They bomb Nauvoo. It's called the Battle of Nauvoo. Did you know that it was June? Let's see. It was September 11th. The Mormons had their own 9/11. Most
Oh
people
wow!
don't. This is September 11th, 1846. The locals came and for hours bombed the residents of Nauvoo that are still left. And I have a couple friends that have cannonballs from that battle. I saw 2 of them last time I was in.
Isn't that crazy? I mean, when you think about that, could you imagine that happening today? Could you imagine another people attacking a city like
the
like in
neighbors.
America today? Like
Yeah, with
that's
cannonballs.
That's
Yeah,
crazy.
Absolutely.
So not once did those people, as well as John Taylor or Willard Richards or Brigham Young, stand up and say, why are you bombing us? Don't you remember we had the secret pact? I know Brigham Young was in Boston, and there was no way he could have even had a clue Joseph was in Carthage that weekend and Hiram. But we had this pact. Don't you remember? You stormed the jail, and even though you shot at us, and Joseph was killed outside, we had this pact. No, they turned on. Not once did anybody ever claim that they had planned anything, because they didn't. Again, let's talk about it. They said that they were going to do it. That morning they got together, they met at Golden's Point, said that they were going to do it. They stormed the jail. And I didn't even tell you the best part. They came back that night and they had dinner we talked about the Warsaw House, how each city had this hotels slash restaurant. They came back to the Warsaw House. The first mob members came in at about 7, but they gathered about 9 o'clock at the Warsaw House for dinner. Nobody in town knew what happened. They came in all bragging, we just got rid of the leading men of the Mormon church, is what they said. They sat down. The waitress, they did not know this, was an 18-year-old girl. She was a niece of the person who ran the hotel. She was a member of the church. Her name was Eliza Graham, one of my personal heroes. She was shocked, as you would be, if suppose you were a waiter or waitress and somebody came in and said, yeah, we just killed the first presidential candidate assassinated, or we killed the prophet or whatever. The mob grew to 40, 50 people, and they were all bragging as she served them. Oh, it was my gun, Jacob Davis said. Or William Grover said, no, don't you remember? I was the one in the firing squad that Levi Williams told. She memorized who said where and what they said and how they said it. Very shortly thereafter, they stayed up till almost 2 o'clock in the morning.
Did she testify at all?
Yes.
Was she involved in
so
the trial?
Here's what happened. The next year, she moved back up where her parents lived in Nauvoo, okay? And the next year, there was a trial. I mentioned that 9 people were indicted by a grand jury. 5 people showed up. Okay. Now, this is what's really interesting about the trial, because there's a lot of misunderstanding. And we've got an hour and 15. We can go a little further here. So
let's keep going.
So the trial happened. Thomas Ford promised a trial. There were other cases about twice a year. There wasn't enough court cases, so twice a year a traveling court would come through. It was called Court Week in Carthage. They had no TV, no drive-in movies, no Twitter, so the community would come out for entertainment and see all the trials. Way. Well, so they came up with the People versus Levi Williams, not the People versus anybody else. That court case came out. There was a seated jury. There were some members of the church there. The church leaders knew that this was going to be a sham trial, and they told church members not to go. Why? Because Joseph and Hiram were not safe. They had been murdered in Carthage by these people. John Taylor, Brigham Young, and Willard Richards said, we're not going to be safe if we go.
Now that's one of what the other side says is they didn't show up because they were guilty or something. I don't know. Trevor, do you know what they say exactly? Or maybe you know, I've just heard that as part of their argument. That's why those guys don't show up.
They don't know their history because they'd been militia mobs posted around Carthage. There was over 1,000 armed people to keep any Mormons from testifying. And somehow
plus, if I'm John Taylor or any of those guys, and a year ago I just saw, people shooting at me, I'm not going to go around those people. I'm not going to go back. I'm out of there. I don't want anything to do with this. I'm going west.
The other side forgets that there was a mob station there. And here's what's more important. They were allowed to open carry inside the courtroom. People had weapons inside the courtroom. People of the mob were there watching their friends on trial. Would you go testify against 100% mob and their friends in the audience? Are you kidding? That's what makes Eliza Graham so brave. They snuck her through. And she came up, and I think two members of the church testified, William McBatry, maybe three, but she was a star witness. Okay. So before the trial started, the defense, including Joseph Smith's previous lawyer, Calvin Warren, who had declared bankruptcy because Joseph went buy land in Warsaw. He was one of the two.
So he's already mad. He's already mad at the situation. Yeah.
So Calvin goes to the defense goes to the Judge Young, and says, you know what? We have Mormons on this jury, and this jury was seated by county commissioners. They weren't Mormons, but they were elected by Mormons. This is a tainted pool. Can we please have the jury dismissed, and we'll get a new jury? And the judge says, well, we've never done anything like that. And he said, who would we get? And he said, we'll just pick some people out of the audience. And the judge says, again, we've never seen anything like this. And the defense says, there's never been a trial like this. And the judge says, okay. They dismiss the jury, and they randomly pick 12 people who are mob members and put them on the jury for this one case. Reseat a seated jury. Then they testify, and of course, I think it's 8 or 9 days. Eliza Graham gives a beautiful testimony, tells again who said where, what they said, and how they said it. Later on, a court observer and wrote a community memoir, and he says his name was John Hay. I mentioned Charles Hay, the doctor. John Hay was his son. He was young at the time. He grew up to be ambassador. He grew up to be President Lincoln's secretary. In 1869, December of 1869, in the Atlantic magazine, monthly magazine, which was a national publication at the time, he wrote The Tragedy of the Mormon Prophet. And in it, he wrote, Eliza Graham remembered exactly, she fed the mob that came in. She remembered who said what. Unfortunately, she remembered too much, and her testimony was dismissed. She remembered too much. That's what John Hay wrote in that article 20 years later, 25 years. He also said in that article, there was not a man, woman, or child in the county that did not know that that these men had done the murders. It was just not proven in the law, and the the verdict of not guilty was right. Everybody knew that they'd done it. There was no question that the mob had done it. Enemies of the church, members of the church. The church knew it was going to be a sham trial. They didn't come because, in fact, it was brief, even hardly mentioned. And they had a second trial for Hiram, and the prosecution didn't even show up, Lamburn, and they just dismissed that. They didn't even have a trial. So these people left. Somebody asked Thomas Sharp years later, did you kill Joseph Smith? And he slightly looked and says, well, the jury said not. Thomas Sharp went on to become the mayor of Warsaw. He served 3 terms. He's buried 1 mile north of the Carthage Jail. You can go there today. Governor Ford is buried over in Peoria.
So
you're telling me, let me just lay this out really quick. So the conspiracy theory, the tinfoil hat conspiracy theory, which is everybody likes a good conspiracy theory. Well, maybe not everybody, is Brigham Young had motive. He orchestrated behind the scenes killing Joseph Smith. And then you take what you just said, that we know that Joseph Smith knew about this, that he publicly talked about it with his people. He accused these people publicly. Then they did it. They said they did it. They bragged about it after the fact. They went to court, didn't even give a testimony, and yet here we are with, but Brigham Young was behind this. That's the counter argument.
Yeah, Joseph Smith, said he had a vision that if he didn't destroy the press, there'd be blood in the streets and not. Okay. You're exactly right. They said they did it. They published they did it. They stood trial. They never fingered anybody else. Joseph Smith wasn't killed upstairs. I'm sorry. If it was an inside job with Willard Richard and John Taylor, they did a lousy job because they didn't do it. He was not killed up there.
I could have got it done.
Yeah.
So that there is some truth in that. There were people that were close to Joseph that turned against Joseph. It just wasn't, the Brigham Youngs, the John Taylors, and the Willard Richards. But so that the half truth is that there were people that were close to Joseph that absolutely turned against Joseph. That resulted in
loss,
yes.
Guys, Brigham Young and John Taylor and Willard Richards did not turn. They were the supporters of Joseph. And what's really interesting, we talked about the succession crisis. We'll come to that next. Brigham Young didn't know he was going to be the next prophet. Sidney Rigdon was next in line. In fact, he claimed it. James Schramm.
And the truth is, Sidney Rigdon kind of makes the most sense from just Oliver Cowdery would have made the most sense had Oliver Cowdery been around. I mean, obviously Hiram, if Hiram wasn't dead, but you get those two guys, and Sidney Rigdon, in my mind, logically would have been the best fit. I mean, he was with Joseph Smith when they were getting those revelations out at the Johnson farm. I mean, Sidney Rigdon was a powerful orator and speaker. And so certainly I would think that everybody would think that Sidney Rigdon's the next guy in line, not Brigham Young.
Yeah. And in fact, he almost took over the church. Brigham Young was coming back from Boston, not knowing except what he just told weeks, days later. And he comes to town before the big showdown in the Groves that we know about, and prevents Sidney within an hour or two. He got there just before Sidney was going to declare himself guardian of the church.
So how did he convince him? Do we know?
What's that?
How did he convince him? Do we know how he convinced him?
No, he just said, "You're not taking over. Let's meet in front of the church in a couple of days," and that's when they had the showdown. Okay. So yeah, there's no way Brigham Young could have been behind it because he was in Boston. News traveled slow. He had no idea Joseph had turned himself in, had gone to the Carthage Jail. But it was a mob. They said they did it.
And it was almost like Joseph knew that. He said it. Yeah. Another prophecy that he made about himself, right? That he knew his time was done.
Was I go to like the lamb to the slaughter? People say, "Well, was he really a martyr?" Yeah, you can be a martyr and shoot back. Martyr is there's different definitions, and one is that you die for what you believe in. And he died to protect the church. He felt like he told. Well, let's not get too far. He told one of his people that he was sealed to that he had to go and shed his blood to seal his testimony with his brother. That was before.
And I think he kind of knew.
Well, hey, I want to bring this up then. Michelle Stone brought up a point on our podcast that was very interesting to me. She said, we don't have a single record of any of the people that Joseph was sealed to before he was going to Carthage. You think he would have communicated with them or contacted them or told them something? You just gave a firsthand account.
Yeah. Kimberly Watson Smith has that account. I think Jacob Hansen and Brian Hales also. Yeah, he gave firsthand accounts to people he was sealed to. I mean, it's probably acknowledged. There's not any credible historians out there for 100 years that say Brigham Young made up polygamy.
Yeah, no, and just so you know,
Just call.
I don't believe that either.
And
So
anybody who says that Brigham Young made up the endowment doesn't understand the red brick store scenario of what happened there too when Joseph introduced the endowment, but that some of the same people. So let's talk about the secession crisis. Was there a motive? Well, Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles had the keys given to them, right? And so people who followed Brigham Young, which was a large body of the saints west, now followed him and understood. Some had been there with the vision of Joseph's mantle falling on Brigham. Other people who weren't around followed James String up to Borey, Wisconsin, and then eventually to Beaver Island. Other people followed Sidney Rigdon back to Pittsburgh and then down to Mahogany Alley. Some people followed Miller south to other places. Some people just hung around. And in April 6, 1860, Joseph Smith III was part of the formal reorganization of the church. They felt that the church had fallen into disorganization, and so they were going to reorganize the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's where the term comes from. A lot of people don't know how that got there, the disorganization. They all had to come up with reasons why Brigham Young wasn't the rightful successor. And so the easy one, people not having the history, oh, Brigham Young must have killed Joseph Smith. That's where the motive came from. In fact, in the 1970s and 80s, the reorganized church, there was a video on YouTube of somebody, I'm not saying it's the reorganized church themselves, a member of the reorganized church kind of re-aired this. And I believe that the documentary that you talked about was kind of loosely based upon some of these earlier charges. This wasn't brand new. This had been around for a long time. And historians say that's impossible. We know the facts. We know what happened. We know the trial. We know where Joseph Smith was killed. But it became the succession crisis where we had multiple people. James Strain that went up, like I said, up north. He had a letter of appointment. I've read it. I believe it. Some people.
it sounds like it sounds like it just made him the stake president. Like that's what it sounded like to me. Yeah,
Of Wisconsin.
yeah,
And
of that area.
And William Marsh, of course, was the stake president of Nauvoo, and he didn't get along with Brigham Young and the church that went west either. And so there's a lot of things here. We've kind of went over Warsaw, the role. People came back. We talked about Thomas Sharp, other people. Aldridge.
So they probably thought if we can get rid of Joseph Smith, this religious movement will die. And one of the things that we know is when you kill the leader, it actually inspires the people. And so it appears that it inspired them to move west, which I think was by divine design. And in my opinion, listen, I don't love a lot of what Brigham Young did once he got out west, but I will tell you this. I believe there is no other person on planet Earth that could have moved that large of a body of people and then organized them and laid out this beautiful city and map and streets. Like, I'm talking, he was one of the greatest frontiermen that has ever existed. I don't care what you say about him. And the Lord used him to do that, to get us to where we are today and what we get to enjoy today.
Let's just say this. Brigham Young was a man of his time, but he was the greatest prophet since Joseph in our dispensation. And he gets thrown a lot of shade because of culture differences that we have today. People diss on him. He was phenomenal for what you said and other reasons, and he's not getting the credit.
Yeah, and I get it. Listen, culturally, it was a different time. And one of the things that we have to understand before we start talking crap on somebody is you don't know what you would have been like had you lived in that era, in that time, and been through everything either. And so it's hard for us to say that somebody is a horrible or a bad person because the time was completely different. And it'd be like them looking at us and judging us because we don't grow gardens and we go to the grocery store and they're just like, oh, these people, they are crazy. They are the worst and they're not following God.
I will predict that in 100 years, our progenitors will look back and think we are terrible people because we have phones made in sweatshops in China.
Probably so, right? Yeah. And they were
how
using
horrible
these.
a people we are today for
I
having
already, I already
electronics.
think that you're on. I think you're on track. I already think that.
But we're people of our time. This is what it's come. So, where do you want to go from here? You want some more
Okay.
prophecies? Want to take a
So,
break?
so, so, so I think that really breaks down the martyrdom and kind of gives us the history. And so I appreciate you giving us the history. Trevor, do you have any of the questions that you have that haven't been answered that you want to jump into?
I was just flipping through it.
One of the questions I have, just because I'm curious about your perspective, and we've talked a little bit about Oliver Cowdery. So Oliver Cowdery comes back in 1848. What are your thoughts? Why of there you got all these splinter groups out there, and Oliver Cowdery chooses to go back and join the body of the church? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they had an old movie about that, and it was absolutely phenomenal. Of him coming back and say, "I seek no station," and he looks at, I think it was Heber Kimball, and he said, "I was there." I think it's absolutely phenomenal, and uh, Whitmer's didn't come, but Martin Harris came as well. And you guys living in Utah, you've probably been up to the Harris pageant. Even though they had their differences with Joseph, they knew that they never denied their testimony, and they came back with the body of the church because they knew that that's where the truth was, the keys.
Well, and what's interesting is Oliver could have said like, "Hey, I actually have the keys." Like if you go read when keys were passed, guess who was there? Oliver Cowdery. He could have showed up there and said, "No, no, 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 no. I'm seeking to be this." But he did. He was just humble. That's why I feel like he had some kind of revelation. The Lord said, "Oliver, I appreciate all that you've done. I need you to go reinsert yourself just as a humble servant. And I just need you to testify of all of the things that happened because the saints are going through some probably really hard things and they could really use you to say, hey, this happened. This is true."
That's true. And they got out. They had the Reformation. Joseph or Brigham Young said, "You know what? We really need to recommit ourselves and be baptized again for our sins, not for membership in the church again." And then the reorganization happens, and Emma and her son Joseph Smith III and comes out, and they duel with Joseph F. Smith, their first cousins. Joseph F. Smith, the son of Hiram, and one's president of our church, and the other one is president of the reorganized church. They call them dueling cousins. This is early 1900s, end of 18, and they send missionaries out, reorganized in the 1880s, 1890s to Utah, and say, "Come come back to." They had moved from they had organized in Plano, Illinois, and they had moved to Lamoni, Iowa, and before they ended up going back to independence. And they said, Joseph never practiced polygamy. And there's ladies there says, "Are you kidding? I was sealed." They were older ladies to these young missionaries. "I was sealed to Joseph." People in Utah in the 1880s, 1890s, talking to reorganized missionaries when reorganized missionaries said, "Let's come back to," and Joseph never practiced polygamy. And they said, "No, I was sealed to Joseph in a dynastic plural marriage." And later, Brigham Young introduced full-blown, polygamy with children. And it was a small percentage of men, and there was women that needed to be married to righteous priesthood holders of biblical custody. That's a whole different topic.
Yeah, a whole different topic, whole different story.
I actually wanted to ask that clarification. So, are you saying that from what you've studied, that you think that Joseph Smith took the polygamy to here with no children, and then from Brigham Point on, they started practicing it with children?
Yeah, again, the dynastic sealings occurred with Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. Very clear. Lots of
that's why you find Don Bradley talks about this. You find some sealings that you're just like, Why would he sell himself to this person or to this person?
Yeah.
But
67-year-old. Yeah.
Well,
That
let
was
me just
selling
get clear.
families.
Let me just make sure I'm clear for the viewers too. You're talking about polygamy and having children with those wives, not being married to multiple children, because that's kind of how it sounded
Oh, I'm
when you were
sorry.
saying it.
And I misstated, and somebody's going to go back through and get a couple clips. There's not a lot of contemporary records. Joseph was sealed to multiple women in a dynastic setting and no kids. He could have had kids with anybody. He had what 10, 12 or whatever with them.
Emma.
Only half of them survived, but to adulthood. But it was Brigham Young that brought up whole plural marriage that way. So
yeah,
we have later records, we have some current records, and but it was well known. Again, the mob knew it. People published about it. We called them the
yeah.
polygamist.
I'm not one of those guys that they're called polygamy deniers that Joseph Smith never talked about it, never mentioned it, never.
He
It was
preached
clear.
against.
Yeah, yeah.
He preached against unauthorized plural marriage, but then he
Yeah.
practiced it because it
Shane,
was.
there's a whole entire hashtag on Facebook and Twitter. It's called 132 Denier. It's kind of taking a play
Interesting.
on the 9/11 denier,
So,
132 denier.
so if you believe that, and you believe Brigham Young invented it, then you can't, in consciousness and logic, be a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Can you?
I would have a hard time with
Those
it.
are
Yeah, I
those
agree.
are arguments that you would get from somebody in the reorganized church or the string-eyed church or have left the church. I believe that you can't say 132 was invented and still believe that
Yeah,
The priesthood's still valid. It's
it
consequential.
yeah,
and
it's
Russell
such
M.
a
Nelson is the prophet, and he has the keys, and you go and you recommend, and you say, do you support, or do you sustain, Russell M.
it's a hard thing because
as the only
because
person, hold on, as the only person who is authorized to exercise all priesthood keys, and then you also, number 7, you support, affiliate, or promote any teachings or doctrines that oppose those taught by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we teach and publish 132. So if you don't believe 132, you can't answer number 7 correctly. And we talked off record. Yes, I serve as a bishop right now, and I ask that question every week. Number 7. You cannot be a polygamy denier. That's what people outside the church should be. Because if you're in the church, you have to accept Doctrine and Covenants 132. It's our canonized scripture. If you're going to be a member,
what do you
standing
what
at
do you
least for that
what do you
recommend
say
question.
what do you say to people? Because here's like when I read, and I'm like maybe I don't have all the answers, but one of the things that stands out to me that gives me a little bit of heartburn is that Isaac is mentioned as somebody who practiced polygamy. And I cannot literally, I've read the Old Testament. I find that Isaac only ever had one wife. And so there is that causes me to go like, are they just using that term Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because they use that term loosely to describe that period of time? But that is one of the things that for me in 132 stands out to me because I have nothing in the Old Testament that tells me that Isaac practiced polygamy.
How many years does the Old Testament cover?
Oh man, a couple thousand.
And how many pages is the Old Testament?
Yeah, it's
okay. It's not comprehensive. Okay.
Yeah.
I believe
really
there's a lot
isn't.
of things that are not included in the Old Testament that were revealed through modern day revelation, including 132. There's probably some apocryphal, some outside source outside the Bible that will sustain that as true.
Yeah,
Well,
I
in
just
fact, in fact, what you say is more true than you know. There's an apocryphal writing that was emailed to us as we started releasing some of these record videos that we have, and it's of a people who were in the Philippines and they practiced polygamy very very clearly. And what was the doctrine they called it, Shane? Do you remember?
Oh, I can't remember, but it's a book called the Anglican, and it's a record of a people in the Philippines. Interesting record, but anyways, Well,
David, you haven't said much. Do you have questions?
I do. I had one question I want to ask about your when you were touching on um, the prophet being potential president can or a
Yeah.
presidential candidate.
Mhm.
I'm curious what you think, and this might just be a silly question, but how do you think the prophet would fare today in today's world if he were to run for president? Just your thoughts,
Are you talking
speculation.
about Russell M. Nelson being 100 this fall, running for president of the United States at 100? And
He
for
would
I've
make
not heard of
40 years,
that.
Biden. He would
I think,
make Biden look like an idiot. He's so
yeah,
much sharper than Biden. People would be like, oh, "Okay, we got to get Biden out."
yeah, exactly. I think he's mentally aware and acute enough to run to run the United States and
Well,
run a campaign. I think there's still a lot of prejudice. Unfortunately, Mitt Romney came close. I think he was hurt by some religious bigotry in
well,
certain quarters.
just and for clarification, I'm referring to the prophet Joseph Smith
Oh,
in
if he
today's
would have
like,
lived, oh, I who knows, what he would, what the political campaign and the platform would look like today. It would
yeah.
probably be revolutionary like it was in his day. Um, there's so many moving parts. Who knows? But a lot of people did feel like he would make a run, and he there was a good chance he would have won in 44. And if he didn't win in 1844, he most likely would have won in 48.
because
That's
he was a young guy too. Like he had
He was
a
38
lot.
when he died, when he was
Yeah,
shot and killed by the mob, not by anybody else. I just
yeah.
had to throw that in there.
zing, zing, zing.
Well,
I
cool.
love it.
This has
So
been
so Shane, before you cut out, one thing I wanted to mention is we added a new feature on Zion Media up in the click on our name button where you can leave us a comment or you can suggest a guest or a host or a subject. And Shane actually knew who Brian was beforehand, but I hadn't heard of Brian. And we had one of our guests say, "You got to interview Brian Stutzman. He knows everything about this," and came really highly recommended. And then a bunch of other people are like, "Oh yeah, Brian's amazing." And so, if you've got some people for us to find, some other guys like Brian that can bring in some light into some conversations or other topics that you want to hit, message us.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
we go
oh,
ahead.
go
Well,
ahead.
I just wanted to say that there are a lot of people that we do want to interview. So for viewers, if you do want to see someone on the podcast and you have a way to or a means to get in touch with them, definitely let us know.
Yeah. So we appreciate Brian coming on because we're just trying to get both sides of the argument. I have my own personal beliefs. Trevor's got his personal beliefs. Dave's got his personal beliefs. But I think it's important that we have the discussion, that you hear both sides of the argument, because I hear things on both sides of the argument that I'm like, oh, I need to go look that up. I need to go fact check that, or I need to go fact check this. And I think we're coming into a day of DNC 121. I think it's verse 25 or 28, where what does it say, Trevor? Nothing shall be withheld from them. So I believe we're coming into an era and a time where truth is going to be revealed, and maybe some of these things we're going to find out the actual truth on what actually happened on these things that to a degree there is some speculation because we weren't there. But I do think it's important, as we had this discussion today, that we recognize that it's not, as Brian says, we shouldn't throw shade on those that lived 200 years ago, whether that be Joseph Smith or Brigham Young. Even if we don't agree with some of the things that we're reading, we don't understand their time, their culture, and what they may have been dealing with. So who are we to judge them? So
Or
Brian,
George Washington.
or
I'll go
yes.
further and say that there's not a truth meter on the internet. Sherry Do once said that in conference. There's not a truth meter. Just because it's out there doesn't make it true. And I hear people say things about the martyrdom, and it's just not true. I hear people say things about polygamy. You can say anything on the podcast, but what really happened? Go back and read John Hayes' article in 1868. Go back and read the expositor. Go back and read the writings, the contemporary writings of people who were there at the High Council meeting in 1843. Read what the mob said after they killed Joseph, that they had done that. And then you got to take that as more credible than somebody sitting in their mom's basement or whoever's typing stuff up, making up stuff, or the enemies of the church coming up with these wild theories. There's truth out there, and then there's people who have half truths and no truths. And just because somebody says some things doesn't make it true. Look at what the general consensus is of dozens and dozens of historians, credible historians, people that write for the church, people that write histories. Look at original sources. All claims are not equal. Okay.
Yeah, totally.
People who come on your show sometimes, or people that are out there on the internet, say some wild stuff, and some of it, one of my favorite. This is a deep subject here, deep thought. One of my favorite thoughts, one of my favorite sayings is, "It's not what you know that gets you in trouble; it's what you know that isn't so that gets you in trouble." You can think that something's true, but it just ain't so. That's where you get in trouble.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you.
That will get you in trouble.
Yeah. Thank you for that,
Thank you so
Brian.
much.
And just so everybody knows this, listen, those that have organized this church, those that run this church, they're not perfect, and they probably made mistakes along the way. And this is what happens. They're imperfect humans. And, as we're trying to find truth, I think it's important that we share or have grace for everybody. And we just recognize that they were doing the best job that they could do. And the Lord made do with the team that he had. The Lord's like, okay, this is my team. I'm going to make do with this. And we should be grateful for all of those that have come before us, because I am sitting in a beautiful home on Main Street in Farmington because of the price that those people paid to walk from Nauvoo all the way out to Utah. And so our gratitude is with them. For myself, I'm Shane Baldwin. Oh, do you got something else, Brian, real quick?
Let's not get caught up on gospel hobbies. If anybody bases their testimony on any podcast out there, they just don't understand what a testimony is supposed to be about. These are fun to learn about our heritage, and we can even strengthen our testimony, and we get courage from hearing the prophecies of Dan Jones and what he did, and Eliza Graham, my personal hero. But if anybody bases their testimony and their eternal salvation on what somebody says about 132, or somebody says about who died where, they've missed the mark.
Amen.
Go David, to the scriptures. Go to the.
Did you hear that, David?
The teachings of the prophets, of the scriptures. Get the Holy Spirit in your life and get confirmation. That's the sure rock. These are all fun topics. They're fun to talk about. They're fun to be inspired about. But this is not where your testimony needs to be.
Thank you, Brian. I was about to say the same thing. So thank you.
Yes. And for me, it's like whenever I hear somebody that's having a faith crisis, or they heard this, or they watch this podcast, I'm like, are you reading the Book of Mormon? Oh, you're not? Go spend 30 minutes a day in the Book of Mormon, and your faith crisis will be healed. I promise you. And so it should be rooted in those scriptures and in the prophets that have taught us. And that's where, but these are all fun. So Brian, we appreciate you coming on. For myself, I'm Shane Baldwin, David the Lion Douglas, and Trevor Keys. Until next time, Brian, thanks again. Brian, where can people find your stuff? Where they go to Amazon? They can buy your books on Amazon?
Sure. Now, we probably need to do another podcast, because I have a building next to where the expositor was. And all these things, podcasts as well as books, are on www.martyrdomstories.com. Martyrdom Stories. It tells a little bit about our upcoming project in Nauvoo, as well as podcasts and books, scripture references I've written, books on Warsaw, books on prophecies of Joseph Smith, those types of things. Martyrdomstories.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, guys, until next time, thank you for tuning in.